And then before we hand it off to James for his presentation, we're just going to do a brief introduction into the garden. And we do have a few members of the garden team here. So is it okay if I share my screen?
Absolutely.
Okay, great. Okay. And then I'll stop sharing for a sec so we can see everyone's face and then hand it off to James. So we love working in the garden because we get really great visuals and pictures. So just showing some of them off in this presentation. So today we'll just kind of be going over a brief history of the garden. And then since it's through Zoom and it's easy to hop on, a few garden team members are here so we can all say hello and share a bit of more about the programming and what's happening in the garden. Our team is graduate students and undergraduate students who are really passionate about gardening, and we're lucky to be able to work together and then also work with James and kind of always have someone we can bug with all our gardening questions. So Jerry did a great introduction to kind of sharing our mission at the garden. I was going to share a quick video, but I think I'll just put it in the chat box since sometimes sharing it on Zoom can get a little laggy. Yeah, so I just wanted to introduce everyone on the Garden Oversight Committee or the garden team. James here, who Jerry just introduced, and then we also have Mal Liu, who's our Eat Well Pod graduate student researcher. And so I guess I should back up a little bit. The J&B Semel HCI Community Garden is part of the Semel Healthy Campus Initiative Center at UCLA. It's a bit of a mouthful, but we started 10 years ago. We're actually in our 10-year anniversary with the mission to create a culture of health at UCLA. It's envisioned by Jane and Terry Semel. They're philanthropists, and they're really focused on looking at health from a holistic perspective, including mental health and emotional well-being. So in 2016, Jane Semel was up in what is now the garden space, but at that time it was just all kind of just wild shrubbery in the back of Sunset Recreation at UCLA. And she thought this would be an amazing place to have a garden. And now looking at, I guess it's about almost 6 years later, we have 31 raised beds in the garden. We have a hillside with passion fruit, guava trees, citrus. So it's been a really amazing space for building community. All of the 31 plots are open to UCLA staff, faculty, students, alumni, family members to come and garden, adopt a crop. And it's been a really amazing space to also look at food insecurity and start to connect people more with the food they grow, and also through partnerships with UCLA's Community Programs Office, Staff Assembly here, which we love to get engaged with, and other groups on campus. The garden has, shown to be a really diverse and I guess usable space. You can use it in a lot of different ways, and it's, I think now, more than ever, people are seeking that hands-on experience, which the garden is all about. So, sorry, Mal, my introduction of you kind of diverted me into that background, but I'll hand it off to the garden team now, and I'll stop sharing so you can see our faces.
Oh, are we just briefly introducing ourselves?
Yeah, I think you could say hi, and then I can share the screen again and flip through the slides.
Hi, everyone. I'm Mel Liu. I'm a graduate student researcher with the Eat Well Pod, which is part of the Healthy Campus Initiative at UCLA. And we work very closely, or are part of, I guess, when together doing work with the Jane B. Semel HCI Community Garden. I'm also a Master's of Urban Regional Planning student, and yeah, excited to be here today. I'll pass it off to, I see, Sage.
Hi everyone, I'm Sage. I'm a third-year environmental science major, and I'm one of the garden coordinators. So I help maintaining the garden and also running programs that we have. And I'll pass it off to Allie.
Hi everyone, I'm Allie. I'm a fourth-year undergrad geography environmental studies major. I'm also a garden coordinator, part of the Garden Oversight Committee, and I work to help with programming and maintaining the garden as well.
Everyone, and I'll share again. So we're also missing Ashley and Derica here, but they're also garden coordinators and they do a really fantastic job in the garden. So here's a picture of the team on the right. And then I'm just going to flip through the slides here and then let me know if you want me to go to the next slide.
Okay, so in early or in late September, we had a volunteer day at the garden, and we had over 35 volunteers come in, and they helped us with a soil stabilization project on our hillside where we have a lot of trees planted. So we planted some wheat to send roots down into the soil and hold it in place, along with some black-eyed peas to help fix nitrogen and feed those wheat seedlings. And we also made some seed bombs for people to drop wildflower seeds around campus and hope that they'll sprout and spread flowers around campus. And then we also just did some cleaning and weeding with the volunteers after the summer break to kind of beautify the garden. I think we can go on to the next slide. And just some quotes from people who came up in the garden space that day. They said that they loved the entire thing, especially getting to work with the campus plots, and also that they liked being able to give back to the earth in UCLA. So the gardens are really a great place to connect with nature and get your hands a little dirty on campus. Next. And yeah, here's just some more pictures of everybody. We had a really great team and we got a lot of good work done. Yeah.
So one of the keystone goals of the garden is to facilitate programming where we can share our love for gardening and our knowledge about planetary health with the rest of the UCLA community. So along with James, over this fall quarter, we started our Regenerative Gardener Certificate program. This was a hybrid in-person and online program where we taught UCLA community members workshops about companion planting, composting, integrated pest management, all these different factors about maintaining soil health to help people manage their garden plots better. And we had about 20 alumni, staff, graduate, and undergraduate students enroll. Almost 15 have completed the certificate program so far, and it's been a really great way for them to have tangible results of getting involved in the gardening and sharing their knowledge about how really to keep soil healthy, and also meet other gardener enthusiasts at UCLA.
Yeah, and I'll just share briefly about some collaborative programming that the Eatwell Pod has done with Jane B. Semel, HCI Community Garden, as well as other groups and offices in the UCLA community. So at Eatwell Pod, we strive to enhance hands-on learning, very much like the garden, and make knowledge and exchange about food accessible while making sure that's connected to personal health, whether that's through learning to cook or what we eat nutritionally, as well as that connection to environmental planetary health. So some programming we did this quarter was our annual food day event, which was in partnership with UCLA Farmers Market, and that happens every few weeks. We have it up on our events calendar. So if you're interested in going to the Farmers Market, which happens at Bruin Plaza by the Bruin Bear, definitely visit our website to find out what dates the farmers market will be happening in future weeks. At our food day event, we also collaborated with Chef Julia Roten from the Teaching Kitchen, who did a live cooking demonstration of a healthy seasonal recipe that highlighted ingredients that are indigenous, some of which are indigenous to the United States, and talked about how to prepare the food in an easy, accessible way for folks who stop by. We also recently did an event with broom beekeepers who we were connected with through Bonnie Benson at UCLA Sustainability. And we also had Wendy Mather, who runs the California Master Beekeeper Program, talk about the importance of pollinators in terms of our food system health. So if you're interested in programming related to all aspects of food, whether that's cooking or the environment, please visit our website. I'll throw it in the chat for folks so you can find out more about the work.
And maybe people, if they're open to it, could also drop their email in the chat box and we can add you to the Eatwell Pod listserv. It's a great way to just, stay plugged in with all these events. And now I don't know if you want to briefly talk about this, or we just wanted to have these pictures up to get everyone hungry during this lunchtime?
Yeah, so the Teaching Kitchen Collaborative, Teaching Kitchen at UCLA, we collaborate frequently through themes through the garden, as well as through programming that I just shared about. And staff at UCLA can participate in this and also find out what recipes and demos they've been doing. They have an Instagram where you can watch virtual cooking demonstrations, but I believe UCLA staff can actually sign up for workshops through UCLA Recreation. And Megan, I believe there's also a program around nutrition as well that might be available to UCLA staff.
Yeah, exactly. And I can put the link in the chat as well. But one of the benefits of the virtual classes is anyone can tune in now, and there's not that capacity limit that the kitchen usually has. Okay. So I guess a few last plugs just to get everyone engaged. If you are interested in gardening, if you are in LA, I know it might be a bit harder for those coming in from Canada or England, but there is a plot in the garden that is dedicated to staff assembly. So you all are able to access that garden. I do believe if you want to get involved, there's a contact at Grace with staff assembly who you can let them know you're interested in the garden, and we'll have a garden membership created for you so that you can easily access the space. And the membership's really just because we're in Sunset Recreation, which has a scan in and out system. So just to make sure you can easily access the garden, but it is a 4x10 bed filled with biodynamic soil from One Gun Ranch in Malibu. Really, really great soil there that can grow a lot of different things in your plot. We're always up there too, so we love chatting with people in the garden. So that's our email, our Instagram URL if you want to sign up for a weekly newsletter that just shares happenings in the garden. Yeah, and we hope to see you, in person at the garden sometime. So I will pass it off to James. James, you want me to share your presentation on my screen, or would it be?
I think I can do it from mine.
Okay, great. Then I'll stop. I'm also happy to answer any questions in the chat.
All right, and Megan, what do you see on your screen?
I see their presentation.
Fantastic. All right. Well, thank you for joining us today, everybody, and I'm delighted to have been invited to this event. In talking about permaculture, I should start by pointing out that I have the great pleasure of teaching the permaculture class here at UCLA, which is a 10-week course. And if you ever feel inspired to get certified in permaculture, you can earn a permaculture design certificate in about 80 hours of study. I'm told that I have about 30 minutes today. So this is going to be a bit abbreviated and it's going to go quick. But if any of you are interested and you have questions, you want to know more, or where you can find more resources on the subject, please feel free to email me. I'll try to put my email in the chat lines. And I'm happy to plug you into anything that you're interested in. I'll begin here by pointing out that the word permaculture originally came from a combination of the words permanent and agriculture, because it was meant to be a more sustainable design strategy for the future of agriculture. But since then, and particularly in more recent years, the word permaculture has been used to refer to a more permanent culture. So it has become a set of ethics and principles that have been applied to business models and to urban planning and to nonprofit strategies as well. So even if you're not a gardener, there's something in permaculture for you. And I will begin here. There's a set of core ethics on which permaculture is built, and then a series of principles that are flexible enough to be applied in a wide variety of ways, again, to gardens, farms, and beyond. In the center, we see the three core ethics of permaculture, and we refer to them as earth care, people care, and fair share. For those of you who have a background in sustainability, you might see some echoes here of the triple bottom line. And that's very much on purpose. When we talk about earth care, we're talking about a stewardship of the natural environment. When we talk about people care, we're talking about a sense of social responsibility. And when we talk about fair share, I mean, that really means some different things to different people, but at least with respect to food, it's simply the idea that everybody should have access to whole and wholesome and nutritious food. From those ethics come a series of 12 principles, and they're arranged in this slide a bit like a clock. And if you'll take the tour with me, I'll start here at the 1 o'clock position, where the principle is to observe and to interact. As a master gardener, the first piece of advice that I often give to people is that the first thing you want to plant in your garden is a chair, because long before you start putting in seeds or seedlings, you want to get to know your garden space. How much sun does it get? And do different patches of the garden get different amounts of sun? What part of your garden stays moist for a long time and what parts dry out quickly? Are there parts that the squirrels and raccoons like to visit? And are there places where your dog likes to dig and things like that? And so we use that information to start making our decisions about what we want to put where. Knowing the world around you, knowing the environment around you really gives you a sense of empowerment as to how to design a garden or even an entire community in a way that's going to work just that much better. At the 2 o'clock position, we have catch and store energy, and that can be taken very sort of literally, in terms of putting up solar panels and batteries and that sort of thing. But it means so much more than that. Just the act of growing food itself is capturing solar energy and storing it as food. For any of you who like canning and fermenting and so forth, those are other ways of catching that food energy and storing it for future use. If you have children, teaching your children to love gardening is a way of capturing that youthful energy and storing it in the form of fruits and vegetables that your family can enjoy. This principle really is limited only by your imagination. At the 3 o'clock position, you see obtain a yield. And of course, as a gardener, as a farmer, the first thing you might think about is, of course, the fruits and vegetables that your garden produces, the food yield that you get. But yield in permaculture can mean so many more things. I work with a lot of school gardens, and people say, just how many kids are you really feeding out of that garden? And that's rarely the main point of a school garden. The yields from a school garden include things like helping the kids develop a taste for fresh fruits and vegetables, or learning how to grow them at home. So it's the education. I know teachers who use gardens to teach science and even history on occasion. There are, of course, wineries in Napa and Sonoma that not only produce grapes and wine in their wineries, but they also host weddings and anniversary parties that produce another stream of revenue for the farm. Or if they're in a very picturesque location, even use the farm setting for photo shoots and movie shoots and things like that. So there can be many yields that can be found in a garden. At the 4 o'clock position, we have apply self-regulation and accepting feedback. A brief story, a neighbor of mine asked me to help her set up her garden, and we did a little brainstorming and got the idea to have a border of strawberries that went all the way down her walkway. And there was one section where the strawberries just took over. They didn't want to be limited to that border. They wanted to take over the entire garden. And in the other part, they didn't want to grow at all. We kept transferring the extra strawberries over to the other part, but then they would almost immediately die. And then I remembered my permaculture training and thought, no, we need to accept feedback here. The strawberries are telling us in no uncertain terms that there were certain places that they wanted to grow and certain places that they didn't. And so rather than fight nature, we cooperated. And she now has an enormous and abundantly producing strawberry patch on one part of her garden, and she grows other things, lettuces and spinaches and so forth in the other part of her garden, and everybody's happy. At the 5 o'clock position, we have use and value renewable resources and services. I'm sure you're all familiar with the idea of solar energy being renewable and so forth, wind energy being renewable. But in permaculture, not only do we recommend renewable resources, but we also encourage people to really be mindful about valuing those resources. Even if your entire home were powered by solar energy, it still wouldn't be advisable to waste electricity. If you're producing extra, you can sell it on the grid or share it with somebody else, or perhaps buy fewer solar panels if you're being a little bit more conservative with the renewable energy that you're using. And in a garden, one could argue that because of the water cycle, water is a renewable resource. Still don't want to waste it. Before you used it in your garden, that water was going someplace else where other people were using it, or forests were using it, or animals were drinking from it, and so forth. So even though we're using renewable resources, we still want to be conservative of them and to value them. At the 6 o'clock position, we have produce no waste. And I want to emphasize that we're not saying reduce waste. We're talking about really eliminating the very concept of waste. As author Bill McDonough says in his classic sustainability book, Cradle to Cradle, waste should equal food. In nature, the waste product of virtually every organism becomes the food or the feedstock for some other living organism. And in your garden, your leaves, for example, really should become mulch and not put into hefty bags and set out on the curb like they're trash. They're not trash. They're actually food for the soil and the microorganisms that live in the soil. There should be not less waste. The idea in permaculture is that there should be no waste at all. Waste equals food. At the 7 o'clock position, we have the idea of designing from patterns to details. We're surrounded by patterns, big ones, small ones, patterns sometimes that we don't even recognize. There are certainly macro patterns in gardening, like the change of the seasons, and any experienced gardener will tell you that certain plants like to grow during certain times of the year. Try planting corn in the dead of winter, and you're probably not going to get much of a yield. And recognizing those patterns, knowing how they repeat, and cooperating with them almost always produces a much more abundant and productive garden space. But there's more than just the changing of the seasons. Rather subtly, nature likes spirals. Nature likes curves. If you look in the room that you're sitting in right now, I'm gonna guess that you see a lot of straight lines. The floor, the ceiling, the walls, a lot of straight lines. Nature doesn't really do that. And when we plant in gardens, I think there's sort of an image that we have in the back of our mind of big farms that plant in straight rows because you don't want to turn your tractor any more times than you have to. I don't have a tractor in my backyard. I'm guessing most of you don't either. Edible plants are happy to grow in spirals and to grow in curves. In permaculture, there's a technique called the herb spiral, where, long story short, you set up a spiral of stones and fill in the space with soil. And so it's sort of a think of an upside down ice cream cone, maybe not that steep, and it provides you with more space to grow herbs, and they're very accessible because they're in that spiral pattern. They're pretty too. There's even something called the golden ratio. You can look it up online. That seems to repeat over and over in nature with the shape of leaves and the number of spirals that you see on a pine cone or a pineapple. That ratio, that bit of natural mathematics, seems to be very appealing to us. Even your credit card, the short end versus the wide end of your credit card, fall into that ratio. I've seen gardens that are purposely designed around the golden ratio, and you can't quite put your finger on it, but they're really pretty, and there's just something very attractive about them, even if you don't know why. And the secret may be in the pattern of the golden ratio. There are many more patterns in nature that we can incorporate into our gardens, not to mention our architecture, for those of you who are in that line of work. At the 8 o'clock position, we have integrate rather than segregate. I'll go back to a large commercial farm where you might see just acre after acre after acre of corn or soybeans growing all the way to the horizon. Nature doesn't grow like that. If you've ever had the pleasure of visiting an old growth forest, there are lots of trees and usually several species of tree, and they're not just trees. There are ferns and ground covers and vining plants and so forth, and they're all mixed together in some part because each plant plays a different and important role in the ecosystem. They're sort of companions in supporting each other, and gardens or farms can be grown with that same concept in mind. There's a Native American technique that's called the three sisters, that grows corn and beans and squash all in the same place. Corn is a grass, and as such, it's very hungry. It needs a lot of nitrogen. Beans, as you may know, are nitrogen fixing. They take nitrogen from the atmosphere and they transform it into a form that the plants can use. So when you plant beans alongside of corn, the beans fertilize the corn. The beans feed the corn. Of course, pole beans need something to grow up, some sort of trellis, which corn stalks provide very, very effectively. So the beans feed the corn, and in exchange, the corn physically supports the vertical growth of the beans. Squash, as you may know, produce these really broad leaves, and they sort of trail across the surface of the soil. So the leaves shade the soil. That helps keep moisture in the soil where all three of those plants need it. It shades out the weeds. So instead of having to pull weeds all the time, the broad leaves of the squash are sort of doing that work for you. And so the three plants support each other, the three sisters. As it turns out, corn and beans and squash also form a fairly complete human diet. You may have heard of succotash, which is made out of those three ingredients. So not only do they play well together in the garden, they also play well together in terms of the human diet and our own health. At the 9 o'clock position, we get use small and slow solutions. In the 1970s, in the world of agriculture, there was an expression, get big or get out. And farms were becoming bigger and bigger and bigger, and we were losing a lot of the smaller family farms. As it turns out, sometimes small is beautiful. Sometimes smaller farms, sort of acre for acre, can be more productive than a larger farm. We always try to find faster and faster and faster ways of doing things, but I don't know, if you ever have a rosebud and you try to pry it open so you can get to that nice bloom stage faster, you know that doesn't work. Sometimes taking it slow and going small can be more in line with the needs of nature and produce a more resilient gardening strategy. At the 10 o'clock position, we get use and value diversity. And I will give you a little story from history. I'm sure you're all familiar with the tragic Irish potato famine. Potatoes are not indigenous to Ireland. The potato is indigenous to Peru, where it comes in thousands and thousands of varieties. And the one variety that made it to Ireland became known as the lumper. They grew well in Irish soil, and so it became a real staple crop for the Irish people. The problem is that with just one species, and because of the way you propagate potatoes, there was very, very little genetic diversity among those potatoes. So in the 1840s, when a leaf blight came along called Phytophthora infestans, virtually every plant was susceptible to it. And within weeks, the potato crop in Ireland turned mushy black. And 1 million people starved, and another 1 million left Ireland for the New World, looking for other opportunities. There's a lesson to be learned from that in terms of embracing more diversity in our agricultural system. The standard baking potato to this day is the russet Burbank. It's the potato that all McDonald's French fries are made of. all around the world. And although there are still to this day thousands of varieties of potatoes, your local grocery store probably has maybe 3 or 4. We haven't learned our lesson yet from that bit of Irish history. Going to the 11 o'clock position, we get use edges and value the marginal. In permaculture, there's something called the edge effect. In fact, in nature, there's something called the edge effect, and that's when 2 different ecosystems butt up against each other. You tend to get this explosion of life. It happens in the riparian zones, on the banks of rivers, and on the edges of ponds. You see it in tidal pools where the ocean meets the shore. You even see it at the continental shelf where the shallower ocean water dips down into the much deeper water. It is literally where nature finds the best of both worlds and makes the most of that. In gardening, we can create edges. In Great Britain, shout out to England, there's a long history of maintaining hedgerows. Small birds like to nest in hedgerows rather than on branches of trees, and predatory insects that would take out what we would otherwise think of as pests like to set up shop in those hedgerows. And hedgerows can also produce a lot of yummy edibles like rose hips and damson, plums, and so forth. We can create edges so that we can take advantage of the edge effect in our own gardens. And finally, at the 12 o'clock position, we have the idea of creatively using and responding to change. Gardens are and people, for that matter, are always in a state of change. We're always in a state of flux. We can fight it and try to keep our garden the same and doing the same thing year after year, or we can cooperate with it. We can go with that change. Again, when we go along with nature, we usually find ourselves with a more beautiful and abundant garden than if we try to fight those changes. Let me pause just for a moment to ask if there's any questions. I'm keeping my eye on my time. And Megan, if I could do a quick sound check to make sure I'm still coming through loud and clear.
Yeah, I can hear you great.
All right, fantastic. To fast forward a little bit, it might be that the ultimate expression of permaculture is something called the forest garden. And it basically is a response to the question of, if in a moderate climate, bare soil left to its own devices ultimately wants to become a forest. If you've ever seen somebody, maybe they tear down a house and the lot is left empty for a long time, you'll see sort of weeds, what we prefer to call pioneer plants, will step in. They'll be followed by brassicas, ultimately sort of hedgy like plants, and trees, if they're given enough time, will start to grow there. Nature wants to grow forests. So the question has been posed for a long time of, if nature likes growing forests, then why doesn't our agriculture look more like a forest? And the forest garden embraces that idea. It is basically a garden that is meant to mimic a young woodland. And just like in a natural forest, it has several different layers or levels to it. The canopy layer, usually very tall trees, certain nut trees, fruit trees, can grow to 50 and 60 feet if you have the space. Some backyard gardeners, of course, will start with smaller trees, but apple trees, again, left to their own devices, can grow to 60 feet high. Following the canopy layer, we get this lower tree layer. These are the dwarf fruit trees that you typically find at your local neighborhood nursery with their dwarf peaches and apples and pears and whatnot. Following that is a shrub layer. These are a lot of our berries, whether they're blackberries or blueberries or currants. There's an herbaceous layer. These are the sort of the fluffy plants that never really develop a woody stem. I'm particularly fond of comfrey, which can be used as a medicinal tea. It can be used to add minerals to your soil. It's a lovely plant that looks pretty and it works hard for us. The fifth layer is rooting plants, carrots and turnips and jicama, what have you, that again take up a different space in the ecosystem. Ground cover plants, if you've been to the forest, it's not bare soil. Plants like to grow at the base of trees and in the little patches of sunlight that they could find. Strawberries are my favorite. Strawberries will grow wild in a forest, and they can be used as ground cover even in a backyard garden. And then, of course, finally, there's our climbers, our vertical layer. The passion fruit that we have at the HCI Semel Garden here on campus has a wonderful hedge of about 50 passion fruits. That are these vining plants. Chayote, a wonderful, productive vining plant. And all these that come together are all edible, but at the same time, they mimic the plants that you would typically find in a natural occurring forest. I won't go through this entire slide, but certain plants play particularly well together. And in permaculture, part of our design strategy is combining plants that will support each other in that symbiotic relationship that we mentioned earlier. Some plants will discourage insect pests. Other plants will attract pollinators. Other plants will produce more food for soil microorganisms, and other plants are particularly good at feeding us. And when you put it all together, you can get a staggeringly abundant and productive garden. I wanted to share with you, to finish, just a few quick images of some forest gardens, or food forests as we sometimes call them. This is one that's in a backyard scale here in Los Angeles, and if you look carefully, you can actually see that they're growing bananas and avocados, and they've got grapevines, and there's peach trees, and there's eggplants, I think, growing up here in the foreground. And for a relatively small space, there's just a tremendous amount of food. I know that the family who lives in this house grows more food than they could possibly consume themselves, and so they're always sharing fruit baskets with their neighbors. This is Mark Shepard's farm in Wisconsin. It's not that he's an artist, it's just that he is growing his crops along the natural contours of his land. He's putting plants where they want to grow, and in fact, he practices something that he likes to call total neglect, where once he plants things, he really leaves them alone, because if they don't want to grow where they are, he lets them pass on, whereas if they're happy where they are, then he lets them take over that space, and he finds that that's the best way to grow the right thing in the right spot. This next slide is in Los Angeles. This is Echo Park. This is actually the little man-made lake in Echo Park. This terracotta tiled roof belongs to the Los Angeles Episcopal Diocese, and this space is their forest garden from a few years ago. It's much denser now, and it has something like 6 banana trees that produce bananas. It's got lots of apple trees and plum trees and pear trees. There's something like 60 fruit trees that grow there now. And this space I love. It looks like a maze or a labyrinth, and that's exactly what it is. It takes its inspiration from some of the cathedrals in Europe that had these huge labyrinths that were inlaid into the floor, so that as a pilgrim you could walk through that labyrinth and use it as a meditative space. And that's what some people do with this labyrinth here in the garden, except that this labyrinth is made out of strawberry plants. So as you're walking meditatively through the labyrinth, you can also bend down and pick strawberries when you find them. I'm just about out of time, so I do want to open up to questions again, but I'll just show you very briefly some of my favorite books about permaculture for those who want to do a deeper dive. Bill Mollison is one of the founders of the field of permaculture, and this is quite literally the book, the textbook that a lot of folks learn their permaculture from. This is also one of my favorites. Toby Hemingway wrote this book, Gaia's Garden, and it takes those principles of permaculture and applies them specifically to backyard garden spaces. This is written by a good friend of mine, Matt Powers, who actually teaches an online permaculture design certificate class. He's wonderfully energetic guy. He used to live in Northern California. He now lives in Texas. And he started off as a school teacher, and he realized that a lot of permaculture classes targeted an adult audience and not so much young people. So he created a whole curriculum meant for K through 12 students, and became so popular that adults were asking him to take that same approach, but for an adult audience. So now he does both. Back to Toby, I mentioned at the very beginning that people are applying permaculture to urban planning, and Toby wrote this book specifically about applying permaculture principles to community development. And we finished with food forests, and so I will too. David Jackie wrote the definitive book. It's actually a pair of books on how to design and how to establish forest gardens at any scale, from your backyard to a commercial farm. And with that, let me take a breath and open it up to questions or comments or feedback or anything you would like to share. If you've been to the semel HCI Garden at the Sunset Canyon Recreation Center, there's been a little bit of conversation, just brainstorming really, about trying to establish a food forest in that space. So as they say, watch this space, because in the years to come, we might find ourselves with our own UCLA food forest right here on campus. I'm looking at my chat. I'm getting a question, is permaculture water-wise? Yes, absolutely. It really starts with the observing principle. And one of the things that you look for is just how much water do you naturally have? And here, in Los Angeles, we're not really in a desert, but we are in an arid Mediterranean climate. And most of our water comes either from Northern California or from the Colorado River. And ideally in permaculture, especially in a forest garden, the idea is that you could plant it and walk away, and you could come back in 10 years and it would still be thriving. I mean, if you think of most sort of just annual backyard gardens, you plant tomatoes, you plant carrots, you plant spinaches. If you walked away and came back in 10 years, your garden would be in rough shape. Forests don't really need a lot of care once they're established. They know how to take care of themselves. And that's part of water wiseness, that if you think, well, what would grow here with the ambient water that we get? When you get into local indigenous food systems, we grow a lot of acorns, a lot of oaks here in California, and they were here before there were people here. Acorns are delicious, and they're actually very, very nutritious. You have to prepare them in a certain way, but oaks are very happy to produce food that we can eat with the ambient precipitation that we get. You don't have to irrigate oak trees where they naturally live. Same thing with nopales, with the cactus. Cactus are delicious. They are really nutritious. There's some research suggesting that they may even help fight diabetes. And you don't need to irrigate them. They grow here very happily, all by themselves. So yeah, in choosing what to grow in a garden, one of the considerations in permaculture is what wants to grow here, even without a lot of assistance. See, I'm getting, can we incorporate ecological garden, native plants? Yeah, absolutely. Native plants, in fact, are sometimes really the best way to go. There's a couple of nurseries here in Southern California that specialize in native plants, and they have a little list of edible natives that you can make the sort of the centerpiece of a garden. And remembering that the Chumash and the Tongva people who lived in the area that we occupy now were able to feed themselves for millennia on what naturally grows here. And we can take inspiration from that when we plan our own gardens. And urban food production. Yeah, our urban structure, and I'll go back to water here for a moment, really allows us to fight nature, to grow plants that wouldn't otherwise, grow here. And again, even though we we can sort of get away with it, at least for the medium term. Again, there's something to be said for, not using more water than you get, or at least really just sipping water, and not, having to sort of, flood irrigate your garden because you're trying to grow something that really likes to grow in a very, very rainy climate. The other thing too is that topsoil, which is that layer of soil that's a mix of minerals and organic matter and microorganisms and air and water, that it's that layer that actually produces food, typically gets bulldozed away when we build houses. A colleague of mine who's a geologist pointed out that, when he started to look at the soil in his own backyard of a newly purchased house, he said it had all the soil biology of a freshly poured sidewalk. He was very disappointed by that. We don't always have the best topsoil, although Los Angeles at one point was the largest agricultural exporting county in the country. My father, who went to UCLA, as I did for my undergraduate work, told me stories when he was growing up of lima beans growing on Westwood Boulevard in a time when Rodeo Drive was actually Rodeo Drive because it was a horse trail. So we had good soil and we were able to grow things abundantly here. If you're trying to start a garden in your own backyard, for example, or even a small commercial farm here in the city, and you struggle, it may be the soil. The first thing you do before you start trying to really, grow a lot of plants, maybe to rebuild your soil, find what organic matter you can, fallen leaves and so forth, and put them on your garden. Take wood chips. If you see somebody pruning a tree and chipping up what they've pruned off, ask them if you can have the wood chips. Layer them on your garden, to add more organic matter. As you build your soil is able to produce more food. Let's see. I'm checking my chat again here. Oh, thank you. Somebody's saying some nice things. Milkweed. Yeah, I'm getting a question about milkweed. There are native milkweeds. In fact, there's something called, if you're taking notes, the narrow leaf milkweed is probably the easiest one of the three big native ones. And those are the ones that we should be growing here. There's a kind of a milkweed that's really a tropical milkweed. It does well in Florida and farther south. And it has the orange flowers on it. And it's, because of its nature, stays in bloom longer than the local varieties do, and that's one of the reasons that people like it. And it grows very quickly, and and again, people like it for that reason. But it's very confusing to the monarch butterflies, because the monarchs, rather than moving on when it's time, will find these non-native milkweed plants with the flowers on them, and they'll think, oh, I can stay here for longer, and they don't continue their migration when they should. Forest rangers here in Southern California basically agree that if you're growing something other than native milkweed, you really should take it out, or at least cut it back hard in the fall, and over time replace it with the native varieties like the narrow leaf that I was talking about, so that we're taking care of our monarchs, but we are also letting them have those natural cues when it's time to move on. Also, just since we're talking about pollinators generally, for anybody with a backyard garden, there are things that we can grow that will feed us that also will help feed our pollinators. They give to us, it's the least we can do to give back. Or even when we're planting flowers, think of not just things that are all going to bloom at the same time, but things that will bloom at slightly different times over the course of the season. So there's always something there for our pollinators to be able to feed on. The Xerces Society, XERCES, is a nonprofit group that advocates for pollinators, and they are happy to share lists that are region specific. So you can get a Southern California list of pollinator-friendly plants that you can plant in your garden. They're pretty, they're easy to take care of, and they will also feed pollinators throughout the growing season, which here in Southern California is much of the year. The local nurseries that specialize in native plants. One is called the Theodore Payne Society, and they have a nursery here in Southern California. Theodore Payne, that's Payne, I believe. And the other is Las Palitas, P-A-L-I-T-A-S, Las Palitas. And they actually have on their website a long list of edible natives. Say about tilling. Yeah, permaculture likes to go no-till. Tilling the soil disrupts soil biology, and you want to leave your soil biology alone to do what it does best. Tilling, even going out there with a rototiller or stuff like that, or just digging or double digging or digging too aggressively in your own garden, can contribute to wind and water erosion. Yeah, permaculturalists for the most part like to chop and drop. That is to say, just when you're clearing old plants, just cut them, chop them into bits, let them just drop on the soil. I mean, if you think in nature, when leaves fall to the ground, that's where they stay and they break down over time, and they add nutrients to the soil. We can do that in our own backyard gardens. I know aesthetically sometimes we're in the habit of thinking, oh, but that's not as pretty as nice, clean, bare soil. But as somebody once pointed out to me, Mother Nature is modest and she likes to stay covered. And so a good mulch layer really, really helps with that. And it also keeps the weeds down. Weeds, and I don't like that word weeds, I like pioneer plants because they're really first responders. If you strip your ground bare, weeds will rush in to cover the soil. They protect it, they add nutrients to it, and they're telling you that you messed up, basically. But if you keep your own soil covered, then the first responders don't have to come in there and do that job for you. You're really trying to kind of create and maintain conditions that are conducive to life, and a good mulch layer is a great way to do that. All right, and there's a good answer to our chronic drought. To a great extent, yes. I mean, we've always been in droughts. I mean, maybe it's worse now, but I mean, California, and especially here in Los Angeles, is a drier place. It's, we're not the rainforest. And yet we grow like a lot of citrus that likes a lot of irrigation, rather than say, figs and pomegranates, and dates. There's a great date farm called, I think it's Shields Date Farm in Palm Springs. That these are desert plants. They are very drought tolerant, and so yeah, I mean, we get our droughts, but if our agriculture is centered more on plants that are okay with that, then we could produce a lot of food and not have to pull water from other places. The Colorado River, left to its own devices, used to empty out in the Gulf of California. There are years now where the mighty Colorado River never makes it to the ocean because we've sucked away all the water before it's gotten there. You can only imagine what that does to the marine life in the Gulf of California. Even if we use a little water, the less water we use, the more water we leave to go to where it wants to go. And somebody's posted the Xerces Society list. Thank you so much for that. Yeah, I love their work, and they publish some books. You go to Amazon, look for Xerces books. They've got great books about how to make a pollinator-friendly garden. We're just about out of time. Last questions or comments? All right. Well, once again, thank you everybody so much for inviting me. I've had a great time. I hope you have too, and I hope to see you all around campus.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Bassett. Thank you, everybody, for joining our Learn at Lunch today. For those of you who are at UCLA, the recording of the presentation and all of the reference materials will be posted on the Staff Assembly website. And we hope to see you at future Learn at Lunches. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you. And thank you, Jerry, for organizing this.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you, James.
Bye.